We are all here because we care about environmental issues, but we have to admit that human beings respond badly to environmental problems. We ignore them as long as possible, and when we finally act, we attempt cheap, quick fixes instead of appropriate or effective solutions. Political economists identify part of the problem in the way costs and benefits are distributed. Where is it? There. Okay. Environmental quality and preventing environmental damage are collective goods. And this is a special term, these include, for me, subtractable common pool goods and non-subtractable pure public goods, but not toll goods, which are different. Collective goods require joint production or mutual effort, and they generate non-excludable benefits. This will get clearer later. The most problematic collective goods are those where costs of production are focused on a few, but the benefits can be diffuse and generalized to many beneficiaries. They are problems where costs now are certain, but benefits later are only hypothetical, so why should we undertake effort? And there are problems when those who carry the cost today are not going to be the same people who benefit in the future. Robert Heilbrunner once said, "What has posterity ever done for me?" I apologize for putting up the game matrix of prisoner's dilemma or free rider problems up here. The main point to understand here is that persons A and B want to end up in the upper left-hand corner, where both contribute to the collective good and they get the collective good as a result. But both are nervous that other people might not contribute. And if one contributes and the other does not, or if a few people contribute but most people do not, we end up in this suboptimal trap in the lower right corner. The suboptimal trap is one where people free ride to prevent risk to self and discover that they end up without the collective good at all. Goods with this problem are difficult to produce. Collective goods have this problem. Environmental quality is a collective good. So let's just take one more look. If we look at the goals and outcomes for individuals in the suboptimal trap, we find that free riders, tadanori, and suckers both want the collective good, but the free riders have invested nothing and gained nothing. They're not worse off than before. That is why they were willing to free ride. But those who did invest but gained nothing have lost resources. They are worse off than before. Game theorists call these people suckers. That's American slang for people who get taken advantage of, people who get used. So to avoid becoming suckers, many people may choose to shirk, many people may choose to free ride, and the more people who shirk in fear of becoming suckers, the less of the desired collective good we get. This, I won't be technical anymore, this is the problem for producing any collective good with exclusion problems. So our choice is, do we just do without collective goods? I have libertarian friends who are willing to just give up. No collective goods, too hard. Or do we search for solutions? And that's my preference. I have spent my life searching for solutions to free rider problems. The solutions lie in fixing the structural features of free rider problems. And societies do produce collective goods. Long-surviving commons institutions are actually creations to solve free rider problems. These are arrangements that have been used all over the world to manage common pool resources. Common pool resources are collective goods that have problems of excludability and also subtractability. Sorry about that. more technical. I didn't mean to get more technical. It may be a very big surprise, but we have good documentation for commons in certain areas of the world where good documentation, literacy extended to the common people. The best cases are in Europe, Switzerland in particular, but Norway, Sweden, England, Scotland, France, Spain, Italy, and more. India and Nepal also, and Japan, where commons are called EDI systems. I'm going to say just a little more. Until the Meiji land grab of the Chiso Kaisei in the 1870s, 85% of Japan's land was common, was EDI-chi. Many Japanese are unaware of this incredibly important part of their history, and they don't even know how to pronounce the word. When they see the kanji for EDI, they assume it is pronounced nyukai, which is the onyomi. It should actually be pronounced with the kunyomi reading and called EDI. So why did pre-industrial societies devise commons? What environmental problems did they have to deal with through inventing commons? One was to prevent mutual harm, local pollution, because downstream effects, especially in mountainous communities, are very serious. Uphill deforestation can damage everything below: fresh water, water supply, fisheries, agricultural fields. They also used commons to set aggregate limits on extraction of resources. All of us, rich and poor, are actually dependent on resources. In traditional economies, the critical dependence on locally available resources was very obvious as soon as the limits were reached. As soon as animals began disappearing, as soon as water pollution began appearing, as soon as flooding began to occur, people realized we're doing too much of something, and we have to limit our extraction. Commons institutions also permit fine-tuning extraction of benefits in very delicate systems. We can actually get more use from systems we might think are not useful, not usable, because commons institutions help us. We see this in arid areas, grazing in arid areas like Central Asia, North Africa, and particularly Rajasthan in India. We see commons institutions used to extract non-timber forest products in multi-species tropical ecosystems where cultivation and monoculture are a complete disaster. But if you don't change too much about the tropical forest, you can still extract a great deal of benefit. And common systems are used to do this. It's also very important in irrigation systems, both those where water is in short supply, as in Spain, or where very abundant water must be carefully regulated, as in all wet rice agricultural systems. The most famous careful regulation of wet rice agriculture is actually in Bali. So, what are the attributes of successful commons institutions? Eleanor Ostrom, a previous awardee, member of the Earth Hall of Fame in Kyoto, and a Nobel laureate in economics in 2009, has written extensively about this. I won't go through her 8 principles of design, but I do want to mention that commons institutions are not romantic creations. They assume that community members are rational egoists, tempted to cheat, tempted to outwit their colleagues all the time. They assume that rural people like themselves are not altruists. This commons analysis should not be thought of as romantic, quaint, cute. Commoners in history have been careful planners and very aware of the flaws of human nature. So what are the institutional techniques used by the well-documented commons where we can see a historical track record? One device they used was to create boundaries around resources and resource users to deal with the exclusion problem. Another was to institute internal monitoring and punishing of free riders. Severe punishments can include immediate death. The Berbers of North Africa used to run right up to the high pasture if they saw an invader and just kill them on the spot. Commons institutions also set a cap, usually a very conservative cap, on total or aggregate environmental use. These institutions are extremely interesting if we're trying to limit consumption, limit extraction. Commons institutions also devise ways to share or allocate both the rights of use and the responsibilities or duties among community members. And finally, they can even be used in very large systems by nesting small systems into larger systems in big hierarchies. This was done for irrigation in Spain, irrigation in the Philippines, very interesting irrigation systems in Sri Lanka. I've already mentioned many other commons in the world, and I'd like to just go quickly through some of the historically strong commons we have available to learn from. Japan, of course, in EDI, used commons institutions for forest, meadow, water supply, fisheries, but notably also onsen, geothermal resources. And many of the strong coastal fishing systems that have emerged in Japan today are considered by my fishy colleagues, who include Chikyuken no Akimichi Sensei, and Bonnie McKay, Jim Atchison, Jim Wilson, and Javier Basurto, consider Japan's coastal fishing commons to be some of the most advanced in the world, advanced in terms of being robust commons institutions. Switzerland has amazing systems of commons and uses them for joint dairy production. The techniques are stunning. I can't describe them here. But they also see commons institutions as a way to produce avalanche prevention. Intact forests keep the snow where it belongs. And then Indian commons are quite noteworthy for combining biodiversity and genetic diversity with human use, and combining, as Altieri Sensei was just describing a moment ago, mixing agriculture, forestry, grazing, and water supply. I'll go quickly through a few more examples. Some of you may know about the mysterious and really bizarre open field system of strip agriculture and grazing in medieval England. Scandinavia's commons are particularly interesting for developing ways to use multiple resources in overlapping spaces. And I must mention the Netherlands. Half of the Netherlands was created out of the sea by commons institutions that produced polders. I don't mean half of the Netherlands has commons. I mean commons institutions doubled the size of the Netherlands. So they produced serious investments, serious labor to extract major benefits. There. Commons institutions, as I mentioned, can be used to extract benefit from delicate resource systems. Mongolia manages 25 million yaks in community herds and using commons institutions. I should also mention that the Fulbe and the Wolof of West Africa actually extract gum acacia for world markets. You can combine, with care, you can combine commons institutions with commercial purposes, but it's a pretty dangerous combination, but it has been done safely in some situations. We also have tropical forest commons. I won't go into great detail, but the contemporary Maya harvest many products, chicle latex, palm fronds, allspice berries, rubber, from tropical forest species that can be harvested sustainably without damaging the forest. And a very famous case, the Dayaks of Kalimantan have a way of doing agroforestry gardens by making holes in the tropical forest. The hole has to be small, and it lasts only 7 years. This is being completely destroyed, of course, by palm oil plantations. We also have commercial commons, I should say we have traditional commons that exist within the surrounding economy sustainably. A wonderful example are the comunidades in Mexico, where indigenous communities own their land in common, and this is legally protected by the federal government of Mexico. The Zapotec and Mixtec Indians of Oaxaca state own 90% of the land in the state, and they manage these forests so sustainably that they are able to generate income over a very long time frame. They do so well that they generate extra income to improve health and education in their communities beyond the levels that the government finds sufficient. But let's go back to Japan, where I can talk to you about distribution rules. My own studies in Japan are so far based in Yamanashi, Nagano, and Iwate. But I want to make sure you understand a little bit about the kinds of things that Japanese commoners have done. First of all, they have very interesting distribution rules. Community members keep careful records and determine how much to extract and how to distribute benefits from the commons on each different product from the commons. We always find that distribution of benefits matches contributions of effort. Households that contribute more get more. Households that don't contribute much don't get much. This produces an incentive to contribute, which deals with the free rider problem. We also see that there is usually a match between distribution of benefit and wealth, household wealth outside the commons, which is to say the distribution is neutral. This seems to be a device to maintain the contentment and the loyalty of both rich and poor families in the community. It is a device to prevent sabotage, I think. Sometimes we find egalitarian distribution of benefits, equal shares per member family. This seems to suppress individual effort, and it shrinks the harvest, and it is intentionally done, I think, when the community discovers it is approaching an environmental limit, and it must discourage further extraction. We can also say sometimes, I don't get any more romantic than saying this, but sometimes success in monitoring can gradually build social capital, and then communities can use the social trust they have developed as a replacement for some monitoring efforts. But Robert Axelrod has done very interesting game theoretic experiments with boldness, the willingness to cheat, and vengefulness, the wish to punish, and would discourage anybody from relying too much on social trust. In Japanese communities, the changing of rules is made very difficult. There is broad community consensus, supermajorities often required for big changes, and the rules intentionally create obstacles to radical environmental change. But the reason for this is bitter experience with tragedy in the past. Communities are conservative not because they're conservative, but because they are risk averse, and they know what the risks are. Okay. Japanese communities also illustrate that strong use rights provide economic flexibility and adaptability over time to a changing economic environment. If commoners have strong rights, they can capture new opportunities, they can use their commons in new ways, they can convert from timber forest to fruit orchard, they can change the mix of economic activities on the commons, they can close commons that are vulnerable to overuse. And in the Japanese case, also in Switzerland and Northern Europe, we can see that the support of external government authorities and confirmation by the legal system are very important. So I've talked about traditional commons in Japan and elsewhere. How can we use these as a model for solving free rider problems in environmental management today? I mean, my original intention was to get policy solutions from our studies of the past. I'll talk about three things. We can reinforce existing commons. We can create modern imitations of commons institutions to build new commons. And we can restore resource rights to the resource-dependent communities around the world that have lost their commons. First of all, in reinforcing existing commons, we would need to establish real and secure rights to resources at grassroots levels. We should be responding favorably to protests that come from the loss of such rights. Not just the Kitafuji and Kotsunagi incidents in Japan, the popular rights movement in the Meiji period was in part devoted to restoring lost, threatened EDI rights. Farmers were mad as hell about having their land taken from them. There are similar protests in India all the time. These are becoming effective. I know that a previous awardee of the Earth Hall in Fame was Vandana Shiva, who talked a little bit about Chipko. India has resource protests throughout the country, and the result is that in some parts of India, the state governments have become very sympathetic and very responsive to the demand for restoration of resource rights. This has happened in Iceland, where fishermen have demanded stronger resource rights, and now they have them, and now the fisheries are recovering. The Atlantic cod is recovering because of stronger resource rights among Iceland fishermen. And of course, I already mentioned the strong rights in Mexico among indigenous communities. We can also use commons institutions to build new commons. We can use these rules, these institutional techniques, to solve free rider problems and enforce subdivided limits on use. That is, if we have limits on use at the planetary level, we can subdivide them into limits at the national level, limits at the regional level, limits at the community level. We can use these design techniques for international treaties, and we do. Regulation within nations, within. We can use them to create new commons in the form of open space and green belts, land use planning in developed areas. We can use them for conservation of ecosystems and habitat. We can then nest these arrangements to deal with problems of scale. But let's get real for a second. Commons institutions have declined in the 19th and 20th centuries. Why? Of course, commons institutions may be fragile, demonstrably unstable, because the free rider problems they contain are real. But the truly serious threats to commons are external. The commoner groups, the citizens who have common access rights, EDI rights, are usually weaker than the powerful others who want the resources the commoners have protected and nurtured. These others include modernizing governments, like Meiji modernizers and post-colonial India. They include aggrandizing political and economic elites, like most governments in sub-Saharan Africa. They include concessionaires, people like Bob Hassan in Indonesia and other timber magnates in the Philippines, who simply want to take these resources and then sell them. They can sell them at low cost if they acquired them free, right? If they stole them. And international market pressures simply make the opportunity to ransack resources for current income look attractive. Actors with short-term interests in huge profit have a tremendous interest in destroying commons so that they can take the resources of the commons. What do these outsiders do? They steal the resources. They steal the rights to the resources. They blame the resource commoners for misusing those resources. Kind of weird. They actively discredit the commons institutions as old-fashioned or conservative or stupid. And these critics, of course, are conveniently ignoring two other things. One, they ignore the fact that environmentally sound management of these resources is a collective good that markets are bad at. And secondly, they ignore the fact that what they plan to do will externalize damage back to the original commoners. That is, they will take the resources and leave the damage behind, separating these two things. Traditional commons institutions did not do that. They will proceed to abuse the resources far more than the commoners ever did. And in some cases where the national governments and their allies have done huge damage, they will then cave and they will finally begin to restore the rights. This has happened. This restoration of rights has occurred in Japan, India, Nepal, and Mexico, in no small part to motivate and mobilize the labor of resource residents to restore the resources. I'll just tell you a little bit about community forestry in Nepal. The national government of Nepal took village commons, cut them, usually spent the money on corruption and election campaigning, and then discovered, oh my gosh, we have no forests. Well, let's give the forest rights back to the community, and then the community will rebuild the forest for us, maybe. Nepali villagers are delighted to have their resource rights back. They're delighted to have community forests, but you can be sure they're very worried that the government will come back and take the forest again after they've rebuilt it. Anybody who has had this kind of an encounter with an external actor who wants to steal the resources is going to be careful about what happens the next time. Oops. So I'd like to end, if we are really to revive these resource systems, then the resource rights for commoners, whether they are the original lost rights or new rights, have to be very, very robust. Most resource-dependent people see the government and its friends as their enemies because of bitter historical experience. They are wary of being robbed again. People who are accustomed to corruption, non-fulfillment of government promises, non-payment for investment in environmental protection, non-payment for resource shares, will be rightly suspicious of anything less than real control. Resource residents occupy the gatekeeper or the jugular position. They can destroy the resource too, if they have an incentive to do so. And commoners will destroy the resource rather than let government and its cronies and its concessionaires take it from them. The frequent technique used in Meiji and Taisho Japan was arson on the Lord's forest to get the resources back. Resource residents who once managed their commons well, but who now see no hope of winning the battle against the grabbers, will instead race their enemies to tragedy to capture immediate benefit from the resource before their enemies take it all. So, in conclusion, we will not get desirable results until democratic revolutions from within challenge the corruption and resource grabbing that we see now. We have corruption and rent-seeking in industrial democracies too. Democratic change and secure property rights are necessary, but they are no guarantee of success. So we all face an endless struggle ahead. Sorry, that's the bad news, but you shouldn't be surprised. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。マーガレット・アン・マッキーン様よりご講演を